Skint Eastwood was the kind of man Liverpool tried to forget, but the corner never did. His name still echoed through its rain-soaked streets, a ghost tied to every unsolved crime, every whispered threat, and every empty house. Years after his empire crumbled, people swore they could still feel his presence, watching, waiting, and reminding the city that some monsters don't die, they simply disappear into the fog. Liverpool's dockside once roared with the rhythm of ships, engines, and men shouting over the noise of trade, but that sound had faded decades ago, leaving behind silence heavy enough to make even the air feel tired. In a forgotten pocket of the city, a small district known to locals simply as the Corner, the past still clung to every wall. The old warehouses stood like skeletons of industry, their bricks blackened by years of smoke and neglect. The smell of salt and rust filled the streets, mixing with the stench of damp concrete and decay. This part of Liverpool wasn't marked on tourist maps. No one came here for photos or stories. It was the kind of place cab drivers refused to enter after dark. Locals spoke little about it, and when they did, it was with a mix of pity and quiet fear. The few residents who remained had learned to survive by keeping their heads down and their doors locked. Curtains stayed drawn, not out of modesty but protection. Once, families filled these terraced houses, and laughter from pubs spilled into the streets. Now, broken windows reflected only emptiness. The pubs were boarded up, their signs hanging loose in the wind. Rats darted across cracked pavements, and stray dogs scavenged through overturned bins. Every night felt colder than the last, and the distant echo of sirens reminded everyone that trouble never slept in the corner. Drugs had found their way in first, filling the gap left by lost jobs and lost hope. Dealers controlled alleys, addicts haunted doorways, and the police only appeared when things went too far. Even then they came late, lights flashing against walls covered with faded graffiti, names of the dead, warnings and desperate prayers. The corner had its own laws now, written not on paper but in blood and fear. Children who grew up here didn't dream of escaping. They learned to adapt. They spoke softly, moved fast, and trusted no one. Every man had a side hustle, legal or not. Every woman carried secrets. Life was a careful balance between staying invisible and staying alive. Outsiders thought it was chaos, but to the people of the corner, it was simply normal. The few community centers that had tried to make a difference closed years ago. Funding disappeared, volunteers stopped coming, hope turned into an old rumor. Even churches struggled to stay open. The bells had stopped ringing long ago, replaced by the sound of sirens, shattering glass, and sometimes silence so deep it seemed to swallow the city whole. Yet beneath all the ruin, the corner still breathed, slow, heavy, and dangerous. There was something about it that refused to die. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe it was the ghosts of those who never left. Every cracked wall, every burned-out car, every shadowed alley, whispered a single truth. Once you entered the corner, it changed you. It didn't matter who you were before, the place made its mark and never let go. Liverpool had many faces, but none darker, none sadder than this forgotten corner. Here, stories didn't end. They just disappeared. Skint Eastwood was not born into power. He built it from scraps of desperation that the corner threw his way. No one knew where he came from or how he got his name. But by the time people started whispering it, fear had already attached itself to the sound. Some said he'd once been a dock worker who lost everything after a factory fire. Others claimed he was an ex-soldier who never really came home. Whatever his past was, it had been erased, leaving behind a man who seemed carved out of the same cold stone that surrounded him. He was not the richest or the strongest, but he understood people, especially the kind the corner created. He knew what hunger did to the mind, how debt could make a man dangerous, and how fear could keep an entire neighborhood silent. Skint Eastwood used that knowledge like a weapon. His power didn't come from flashy violence, it came from control. He didn't have to shout to make a point. A glance, a message, a single rumor, that was enough to change the direction of a man's life. He started small. A few stolen motorbikes, a bit of loan money collected through threats, a job moving packages that no one dared to open. Over time, the jobs grew darker, the profits larger, and the bodies quieter. The corner began to revolve around him. The dealers, the gamblers, even the local shop owners. Everyone paid their respect, whether through cash, favors, or silence. If you wanted protection, you went to Skint. If you wanted something gone, you went to Skint. His nickname came from his style: cheap clothes, second-hand shoes, and an old leather jacket that looked like it had survived a war. He didn't dress like a boss, but he didn't need to. People said he could turn his anger on and off like a light switch. One moment calm, the next unpredictable. There was something almost magnetic about him. Something that drew people in even when they knew he was poison. The police knew his name, but had no proof. He moved carefully, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no paper trails. His operations worked like clockwork. Small crews running drugs and stolen goods through abandoned docks, fake businesses, hiding real crimes, and payoffs that reached deep into the city. He understood corruption. He treated it like a business expense. To outsiders, he was a rumor. To those inside the corner, he was law. Parents warned their children not to cross him. Men who once tried to challenge him disappeared without a word. The streets spoke for him, in silence, fear, and sudden violence that always seemed to come at night. Yet for all his power, there was something restless in him. Something that couldn't sit still. He walked the streets like he owned them, but looked at them like he hated every brick. It was as if the corner reminded him of something he could never escape, and though he ruled it completely, it seemed to rule him back, pulling him deeper into its darkness. By the time the police realized how much control Skint Eastwood truly had, it was already too late. The corner was no longer a neighborhood, it was his empire, built from ashes, fear, and the kind of loyalty that only survives in places where hope has long since died. The night the van disappeared, the corner was soaked in cold rain that fell like ash from a dying sky. Streets were empty, except for the dim orange glow of flickering lamps and the hum of an engine somewhere in the distance. The van, an old white Ford with rust creeping across its doors, was last seen leaving an underground gambling den near the docks. Inside were 3 young men: Kyle, Danny, and Reese. They were small-time runners for Skint Eastwood, trusted enough to handle money, but not important enough to be missed by the city. Yet that night, something about their silence made even the hardened residents uneasy. They were supposed to deliver a large sum of cash collected from illegal betting. It wasn't their first job, but it was their biggest. The route was simple: straight down Dock Road, then a left toward Mill Street, where one of Skint's men would meet them. But halfway there, the van vanished. No sound, no struggle, no witnesses, just gone. Streets always alive with whispers, suddenly had nothing to say. By morning, word had spread. The corner woke up with tension so thick it felt like the fog itself was holding its breath. People knew what a missing van meant. It wasn't just about the money, it was about betrayal. Someone had either stolen from Skint Eastwood or crossed him, and either way there would be blood. Skint's men moved through the streets like ghosts, knocking on doors, asking questions no one dared to answer. The locals kept quiet. They had seen enough to know that in the corner, curiosity could get you killed. The few who spoke did so in half-sentences. Heard an engine stop near the docks, or saw headlights go dark by the warehouses. But there were no bodies, no wreckage, nothing. For days the tension didn't ease. Skint was silent, which made everyone more afraid. When he didn't speak, it meant he was thinking, and when he thought too long, someone usually disappeared. People who owed him money suddenly vanished from their homes. Drug spots went dark. The corner felt smaller, tighter, like it was shrinking under the weight of fear. Some believed the van had been hijacked by a rival gang from across the river, trying to test Skint's reach. Others whispered that the runners had tried to run off with the cash, thinking they could disappear from Liverpool forever. Both theories ended the same way, in death. A week later, a rumor began to circulate. that Skint himself had ordered the hit, that he'd set up the whole job to test his own men, to see who would talk, who would break, who would betray him when the pressure rose. Whether it was true or not, no one knew, but the story spread fast, faster than the rain that fell endlessly on the broken rooftops. The disappearance of the van changed the corner forever. It was the night silence replaced trust, when even loyalty began to feel dangerous. Everyone knew that somewhere out there, under the water, buried in concrete or hidden in a warehouse, the truth was waiting to surface. But in the corner, truth was a dangerous thing to find, and those who searched for it rarely lasted long enough to tell the story. Detective Marden had been watching the corner for almost 2 years, his patience tested by the maze of crime that seemed to rebuild itself no matter how many pieces he tried to pull apart. He had started with small cases, stolen cars, missing persons, drug mules, but all of them led back to one name, Skint Eastwood. Every file, every anonymous tip, and every terrified witness eventually circled back to the same man who never left a trace. Skint was a ghost who controlled the living, and Marden had made it his mission to drag him into the light. When the white van vanished, Marden saw his chance. Disappearances weren't rare in the corner, but this one had a heartbeat. The van had been seen by multiple cameras before vanishing into a blind spot near the docks. For Marden, it was more than a mystery, it was bait. He knew Skint would react, and when he did, mistakes would follow. Mistakes were all he needed. He built his case quietly, avoiding official channels. Too many officers had already been bought. Corruption ran through the department like oil through water, impossible to separate. Marden recruited a small, trusted team. Among them was Sergeant Hales, who had grown up not far from the corner and knew how to blend in. Together, they designed an undercover operation, planting 2 officers as petty thieves looking for work. They rented a damp apartment above an abandoned shop and began their descent into Skint's world. It took months to gain trust. The corner didn't welcome strangers. The 2 undercover officers kept their heads down, stole small goods, gambled in backrooms, and gradually earned a reputation as reliable runners. Bit by bit, they were pulled into Skint's orbit, doing minor jobs, collecting money, watching shipments, and passing coded messages. The more they learned, the darker the picture became. One of the undercover reports detailed how Skint's network wasn't just about drugs. He was trafficking prescription painkillers stolen from medical warehouses, shipping them out through fake doc records. Marden realized this was bigger than he'd imagined. The drugs were being moved under the cover of legitimate shipping containers masked by companies that existed only on paper. It was organized, efficient, and protected. Someone high up was helping him. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. One of the informants went missing. His body was later found near the railway tracks, his hands burned beyond recognition. It was a warning. Marden began to feel the weight of eyes on him. Cars that followed too long, phones that clicked when he answered. He knew Skint had caught his scent. Still, he refused to stop. He gathered the evidence piece by piece. Photographs, financial trails, surveillance tapes, and anonymous notes left by those who had lost everything to Skint's control. He began to see how the corner functioned like a kingdom of shadows, each alley feeding into Skint's empire. Then came the discovery that confirmed his suspicions. A coded ledger found in a seized warehouse listed dozens of fake shipments tied to real deaths. Overdoses, disappearances, even staged accidents, all connected to one operation. It wasn't just about profit, it was about power. Skint Eastwood wasn't trying to escape the corner. He was building a way to own it completely. For Marden, the case had stopped being an investigation. It had become a personal war, one where the enemy was invisible, ruthless, and always 2 steps ahead. The small, forgotten house on Mill Street looked like every other ruin in the corner, its windows boarded up, the roof sagging, and the front gate hanging loose on one hinge. Neighbors barely noticed it. They had grown used to houses like that, silent places that seemed to belong more to ghosts than to people. But behind those walls, something far darker was happening. It was there, in that crumbling shell of brick and shadow, that Skint Eastwood's empire truly began to show its teeth. For weeks the house had drawn quiet suspicion. People heard strange noises at odd hours, the hum of machinery, the scrape of metal, and sometimes the low thud of footsteps moving through the night. No one ever saw who came or went. Cars pulled up without headlights, engines idling before disappearing down side streets. The smell of oil and bleach lingered in the air, carried by the wind across Mill Street. Some thought it was just another drug den, but others whispered that Skint had turned it into something more dangerous. When the police finally raided the house, they didn't know what they were walking into. Detective Martin had obtained a warrant after weeks of surveillance and anonymous tips that pointed to Mill Street as a possible storage site for stolen goods. But what they found inside was beyond anything they had expected. The front door was chained from the inside. When officers broke it open, the air that hit them was thick and foul, a mixture of rot, fuel, and burnt chemicals. The rooms were stripped bare except for a few pieces of battered furniture and flickering bulbs connected to makeshift wires. Down in the basement, the truth came out. Beneath the floorboards, hidden behind sheets of metal, lay rows of wooden crates. Inside were stolen weapons, counterfeit documents, and prescription drugs, all marked with false shipping codes tied to the same docks that Skint controlled. But there was more. Nailed to one wall was a large, hand-drawn map of Liverpool. Red X were scattered across it, each one representing a place tied to an unsolved disappearance. The more Martin looked, the clearer it became. These weren't random crimes, they were calculated removals. Skint Eastwood had been erasing people, not just punishing them. Among the evidence, officers found bloodstains on the concrete and burned photos scattered in a corner. Most of the faces were unrecognizable, damaged by fire or time, but a few were still visible: men who had gone missing, women who had crossed the wrong people, even a few former members of Skint's crew. The basement wasn't just a hideout, it was a graveyard of secrets. Outside, the street filled with flashing lights and confused residents watching from behind curtains. Word spread fast. The police had finally found something real. But even as the evidence piled up, Martin couldn't shake a single thought from his mind. The house had been cleared out just days before the raid. Whoever had been working there was gone, and they had taken the most important pieces with them. Later, forensic teams confirmed that the map was drawn with multiple layers of ink, some older than others. It had been updated over time. Skint had been tracking his own crimes like trophies. Every red X was a reminder of how deep his reach went. The Mill Street house wasn't an end, it was a doorway into something much bigger, a hidden system that stretched far beyond the corner. And though Martin finally had proof of the monster he was hunting, Skint Eastwood himself was nowhere to be found. The night of the raid began like any other, cold, wet, and uneasy. The corner was wrapped in silence, the kind that made every sound feel louder. Rain dripped from rooftops, collecting in puddles that reflected the flashing blue lights moving through narrow streets. For weeks, Detective Martin and his team had planned the operation. They had gathered enough evidence from the Mill Street house to launch a citywide strike. The goal was simple but dangerous: to dismantle Skint Eastwood's network in one coordinated move. But everyone involved knew the truth. Nothing in the corner ever went according to plan. The operation began just after midnight. Police vans rolled in quietly, headlights off, moving like shadows. At the docks, armed officers waited for the signal to breach the old warehouses where Skint's men were believed to be hiding. At the same time, other teams hit a series of addresses, apartments, garages, and backstreet shops, all linked to his empire. Within minutes, the silence of the night shattered into chaos. Doors splintered open, glass broke, and shouts echoed across the rain-soaked streets. The corner was awake again, not with life, but with fear. Dozens of men were pulled from their beds, handcuffed on the ground while police tore through their homes. Some tried to run, slipping across wet pavements before being tackled by officers. Others didn't resist, sitting still as if they had been expecting it all along. Drugs, cash, and weapons were found everywhere. Hidden in walls, buried in yards, even stuffed inside broken furniture. The amount of evidence collected that night could have filled a warehouse of its own. But when they reached Skint Eastwood's house, the one place they thought he would never abandon, it was already empty. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything had been cleared out with surgical precision. No papers, no phones, no signs of life. It looked less like someone had fled and more like someone had prepared for an audience. In the middle of the main room, taped neatly to the wall, was a single photograph, the missing white van, taken before it disappeared. Written beneath it in thick black marker were two words, "Too late." Marden stared at the photo, his stomach tightening. Skint had known the raid was coming. Someone had tipped him off. Every step, every hour of planning, had been anticipated. He had played them like pieces on a board, sacrificing his men to protect himself. The realization hit like cold water. This was never about stopping Skint. It was about showing how untouchable he truly was. By dawn, the police had arrested 40 people, including Skint's closest lieutenants. The media called it the biggest operation in Liverpool in years. News cameras flooded the streets, filming the rows of handcuffed men as they were loaded into vans. Reporters praised the police for taking down a criminal empire, but those who lived in the corner knew better. They knew Skint was still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of the flashing lights. In the following days, the corner fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Heavier, more watchful. People whispered that Skint had planned everything, even the arrests, to clear out disloyal men and rebuild stronger. To some, the raid felt like victory. To others, it felt like a warning. The streets were cleaner, but everyone knew it was temporary. The man who owned them had simply vanished into the fog, leaving behind a message and a promise that he would return when no one expected it. 3 weeks after the raid, when the city began to move on and the news cameras had turned away, a fisherman working near the old pier at the edge of the River Mersey noticed something strange. The tide was unusually low that morning, and the water had pulled back to reveal the top of a white vehicle, half buried in mud. At first he thought it was an abandoned delivery van, one of many dumped by thieves who used the docks as hiding ground. But as he got closer, a foul smell rose from the water, the kind that left no doubt something terrible had been hiding there. He called the police, unaware that he had just uncovered the most haunting clue in the corner's history. When the recovery team arrived, the area was sealed off. The van was old and rusted, its paint eaten away by salt and time. The doors had to be pried open carefully, and what they found inside stopped everyone cold. 3 decomposed bodies sat in the front and back seats, bound with ropes that had fused with their clothes. Despite the decay, the police recognized what they were looking at. The 3 missing runners from Skint Eastwood's crew, Kyle, Danny, and Reese. The men who had vanished on that rainy night months earlier had finally been found. Each man had his wrists tied and his ankles bound. There were signs of a struggle, but no bullet holes. The medical examiner later confirmed that they had died from suffocation before the van had been pushed into the river. The windows had been sealed from the inside with tape, and concrete dust lined the floor, a method used to weigh it down before it sank. It was calculated, cruel, and deliberate. Whoever had done it wanted them to disappear completely, not just die. Detective Marden stood by the dock as the van was lifted from the water, watching mud drip from its sides like thick blood. The smell of rust and death clung to the air. He knew immediately that this was Skint Eastwood's work. The van was his message, a final reminder that he still controlled the story even in his absence. The timing couldn't have been accidental. The discovery came just as the courts were preparing to charge the arrested men. It was as if Skint was saying, "You can catch my soldiers, but not me." News of the van spread quickly through Liverpool. The media painted it as the end of the mystery, claiming the city had finally found closure. But in the corner, closure didn't exist. The locals saw the van as a warning, not justice. They whispered that Skint had planted it there himself, letting it be found to keep his legend alive. The message was clear: the trail would always resurface. For Martin, the discovery was both victory and defeat. The evidence tied directly to Skint's operation, but not to the man himself. The fingerprints had been wiped, the DNA too degraded, and every trail still led to nowhere. He felt the same hollow frustration that had haunted him from the beginning. Skint had turned the city into his stage, and even in silence he controlled the script. The van was eventually towed away and placed in an evidence yard under guard, but its image stayed burned into everyone's memory. For the corner, it became a symbol of the life they couldn't escape, a reminder that their streets, their silence, and even their dead belonged to one man who no one could ever find. Years passed, and the corner began to change on the surface. New buildings rose where old ones had crumbled, and the city council spoke proudly of revitalization. Fresh paint covered the cracked walls, and fresh faces moved into apartments that once stood empty. To the casual visitor, it looked like Liverpool was healing. But those who had lived through the old days knew better. The corner wasn't cured, it was simply quieter. The shadows had learned to move differently, and the ghosts had learned to hide in plain sight. Skint Eastwood had never been caught. After the raid and the discovery of the van, his name vanished from police reports, replaced by coded references and unsolved cases. Yet his legend refused to die. Every few months, rumors surfaced. A sighting in Manchester, a whispered name in Dublin, a shadowy figure seen near the docks on foggy nights. Some said he'd escaped abroad under a false identity. Others swore he was living right there in Liverpool, hidden behind a different face and a different name. The mystery only made him more powerful. Detective Martin retired not long after the case went cold. He left the city quietly, taking with him boxes of notes, photographs, and evidence that never made it to court. Even in retirement, he couldn't let it go. Sometimes people said they saw him near the docks, staring out at the water where the van had been pulled up. He never spoke about Skint Eastwood again, but his eyes told the story. He knew the man wasn't gone, just waiting. Life in the corner moved on, but it carried a strange rhythm, like a song missing its final note. The pubs reopened, but laughter came softly, cautious and short-lived. The new shop owners didn't ask questions about who had owned their buildings before. Children played football in alleys that had once been crime scenes, their parents watching with quiet worry. Even the police, though more visible now, kept a careful distance. There were still places they didn't go after dark, places where Skint's name was still spoken in whispers. One rainy evening, a group of workers renovating an old building on Mill Street made a discovery behind a wall, a faded newspaper clipping, sealed in a plastic bag. It was an article from years ago about the van, the arrests, and the mysterious figure who had escaped justice. Scribbled across it in red ink were 3 words: "Still watching you." The handwriting was clean, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar to those who had studied Skint's files. The police dismissed it as a prank, but to those who remembered the fear, it was proof that the ghost of the corner had never left. As time went on, stories turned into myths. Some claimed Skint was long dead, buried under a false name in some unmarked grave. Others believed he was still alive, older now but no less dangerous, quietly pulling strings from the shadows. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the belief. The corner remained a place where fear lived longer than memory. Even now, when fog rolls in from the river and the lamps flicker along the old streets, some swear they can hear the faint rumble of an engine starting somewhere in the distance. Slow, steady, and familiar. Those who know the story don't look back. They just walk faster, whispering the same words that have kept the corner silent for years. Don't talk about Skint.